Manufacturers are really struggling to get product to their customers. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, it's a problem, and Honda are suffering from that. You're expected to put your hard-earned money down for a bike that you can't ride in the hopes that it will be the motorcycle that suits you best. In this video, I'm going to talk about what are the problems, what are the issues that you're going to have to deal with when you buy this bike, because no bike is perfect, and also what kind of rider I think this bike is suited towards. So the first thing that divides people is the suspension. And I think it's just basically up to the rider you are and how big of a rider you are. I would say if you're average size and you just do average trails, you trundle along, you're not really a speed racer, you don't do any hard technical riding, the suspension is going to be perfect. It's nice and plush, it soaks up all the bumps and ruts that you would expect with general trail riding. And at worst, if you did decide to do some multi-day trips and you got lots of luggage, just bump up the preload a bit and I think the suspension will cope more than fine. The other side of that are the riders with a little more experience. They've been around the block, they like to ride a little harder, they're jumping logs, dropping off rock ledges, they're doing single track, whoops, sand, that kind of thing. I do that kind of stuff. I'm not a great rider, but I do enjoy the more technical stuff. And that's where I've experienced the suspension starting to come undone a bit. It can do it, but I do feel like an upgrade would be nice. It's not necessary, but I think it really would help. The other caveat is if you're a big guy, say you're 90 kilos plus, well over 6 foot, then I think suspension work is probably needed for a guy your size. If you're a beginner rider, you're worried about having to upgrade this famously soft suspension, forget about that issue. It's going to be fine for you for the first 6 months to 1 year. The next one is brakes. I don't think this is a massive issue, but I have noticed that it isn't really any better than the 250Ls. That was a little bit disappointing. Now in the last video, I said it's pretty much the same performance as most dual sport bikes. What I will add to that is I had a little think of it over the weekend, and the WR250R's brakes to me did seem a bit better than this bike, if I'm being honest. I'm wondering whether it's the addition of the ABS to this bike just makes it feel a little less aggressive. With it being 2021, Honda could have done a little more effort. I would have loved to have seen the same disc off the Rally, which is a bigger front disc. I really want to look into whether I can just do that myself. That would be very interesting to increase the braking, but I'm sure it could be fixed with just some braided lines, some better brake pads. However, on the flip side of that is the ABS, and that's where I think this is hard to put in the bag column. With the addition of the ABS, this really makes it a fantastic option for the beginner rider or anyone that does a significant amount of road work. It is a lifesaver in those emergency situations. While the braking performance isn't really huge over here, the addition of the ABS really balances that out. The next one I wanted to talk about is the Snatchy or Jerky throttle. This is something I experience on a lot of EFI single cylinder bikes, and with restrictions getting harder and harder, it kind of, as the years go on, throttles get snatchier and snatchier in first gear is my experience. So the fact that this is a 2021 single cylinder EFI bike, no surprise to me that it's got a snatchy first gear. Is it more snatchy than other bikes? To me, I don't think so. I'm finding it hard to see the difference between it and my WR250R. You may experience it a little differently, but to me, it's not crazy bad. If you're thinking CRF300L problem wise, it's nowhere near like that. It is noticeable, but not a huge issue. And there are a few things you can do to mitigate that. Change the gearing so you can sit in second gear in the slow stuff. You can also do fuel remapping, maybe even a new complete ECU. I haven't heard of any manufacturers doing that yet, but on other bikes, that's generally a way of getting around that problem. If you're used to throttles like that, you can mitigate it a bit with a clutch, but it is something to be aware of. The next one is the engine vibes or the 5K rattle that a lot of you keep asking me about. I have not experienced any rattle at all on this motorcycle. I'm not sure where that comes from. What I have experienced is that the bike is a little rougher between 4,000 and 5,000 RPM. It's still a very smooth motorcycle compared to a lot of single cylinders. It's butter smooth, but it does get rougher from 4 to 5K RPM. So what gets me thinking is maybe this is people that don't really have much experience with single cylinder motorcycles and aren't expecting the bike to get rougher in a certain part of the rev range. So if you're not expecting that and your bike suddenly does that, maybe it feels like a rattle, or maybe it does vibrate the bike a little more and some stuff does hum. I have not experienced that, but I'm suspecting maybe that's where the rumor started from. Of course, I'm open to changing my mind if I do get it. Time will tell though, and I will update you if I do start experiencing it. The main issue here is if you do get a problem with the subframe, it is welded to the bike, so it does become a bigger problem for the rest of the bike. Whereas on quite a few dual sports, like the WR250R, the subframe is bolted to the bike. Same with the KLR650 and many others. So if you get a crack or a break in the subframe, you throw it in the bin and you put a new one on. I think that's a far better system to work with, considering these are bikes that will be used for adventure riding. I intend to load this bike up with bags, and I will have top bags. You can see I've got a little tool bag on there already, so I do need that subframe. So the real question is, what will be the limits of this subframe? It's a very good question. We don't really know. Really, the only evidence we've got is how has the 250L gone? I'm not particularly paranoid about this problem. If it cracks, that's something I'll just have to suck up and move forward with fixing it. Of course, all subframes are going to give up at some point. There's only so much punishment a motorcycle can put up with before failing, but I expect this Honda to be as reliable as previous generations, so I don't think it's a big issue myself, but I can understand why some people think it is, and that's why I wanted to point it out. The next issue I wanted to talk about is this guy here. This is the ABS and the brake cable. It really doesn't bother me. I don't even notice it when I'm out on the trail, but a lot of people have just said it's terribly ugly and it's in the way. Now, I don't think it's the perfect routing system, but I'm sure with braided or aftermarket lines, or even these stock ones, if you got creative with the routing in the bike, this would probably be an easy fix. It doesn't bother me in the slightest, really. It's out of the way of me pressing the ABS. I can see the display just fine. If you are a person that does like everything to be clean and out of the way, this is going to annoy you a little bit. So if you're one of those people that is aesthetically minded and you're a little bit more precious about that kind of thing, it certainly could be an issue, but just buy some aftermarket brake lines and reroute them and you should be fine. The next issue is the heat coming off this motorcycle. And I will say this does pump out far more heat on the right hand side than the 250L did. It isn't something that bothers me so much that it's uncomfortable. The problem stems from the fact that I think they've got the radiator and the exhaust on the same side of the motorcycle this time with the 300L, whereas the 250L had the radiator on the opposite side to where the pipe was routed. So you've got the two hottest items of the motorcycle right here, because there's a little fan just here that sucks all the hot air through the radiator and blows it onto your knee and your shin, as well as you've got a very hot exhaust pipe. So I do have a feeling that it will probably go away with a pipe change or with fuel remapping, but I can't say for sure because I haven't done those things. So where do I think it is an issue? It's an issue if you're doing a lot of commuting and you live in a hot weather climate. When I'm out in the city traffic, stop, start, that fan is working a fair bit, and I'm just in very thin riding Kevlar jeans, that's when I can feel the heat on my leg. It's not unbearable, but it is noticeable. It's certainly not painful. It doesn't ever get to that, but I just notice, oh, that is quite warm there. If you're doing an awful lot of commuting, that might get irritating after some time. For what I use it for, I don't notice the heat at all. Now that comes down to having riding pants. I've got knee guards with shin guards and MX boots, so there's really no heat problems getting through that. It's certainly not as bad as most enduro bikes I've ridden, but it is hotter than the 250Ls. So another thing I wanted to talk about is the coating on the frame of the Honda. I don't think the coating is all that thick thick, as I have noticed that my MX boots have already put some superficial scratches on this frame. They don't look too deep, so it's not really worrying me, but I would have liked to have seen a thicker coating on the frame of this bike, considering that a lot of people are going to be wearing MX boots like me. Time will tell whether that's just in my head and it's actually fine, but it would have been nicer to see the frame be a little more resistant to scratches. Let's talk about longevity and reliability, as that's something that's hard to tell with this bike and needs discussing. There are a few things that I think you can be quite confident of about this bike. The main thing is the motor. That motor has been in Honda motorcycles for many years. We've got hundreds and hundreds of millions of kilometers of testing, and we know that that is a reliable motor and a fairly decent gearbox as well. Of course, that can all change. Maybe the combination of all those things in a new frame and in a new scenario, it could bring up some problems. There's always going to be recalls and problems, but I think it's safe to say that this is going to be a pretty reliable bike. But there is always that possibility, and you have to remain open-minded. I think with every motorcycle, you got to go in with open eyes. You've got to expect that there's going to be a certain amount of problems, a certain amount of issues. Like I said, these bikes generally aren't treated with kindness. They're made to go off-road, and they're going to expect and experience the punishment that comes with that riding. Every bike fails. They all break at some point. There is a point of failure where a machine can only take so much. The question is where that line is and whether that line is consistent or not, and that remains to be seen, but I think it's pretty positive. I think you can unequivocally say if you're a beginner and you're trying to figure out which dual sport suits you, this bike particularly has a lot of things that make it very good for a beginner rider. One, the motor is strong enough to do higher speeds. Two, it's got ABS, so it's got that added safety. And three, it's pretty damn light considering the spectrum of motorcycles. So you're going to be able to pick it up if you drop it off-road. You need a bike you can pick up yourself without it being too much of a burden. So I think for a beginner, this really has a lot of features that make it a great bike, as well as that price tag. I mean, it's hard to walk past. The other rider I think this would be pretty damn good for is the riders that are a bit like me. That is, I'm not an enduro racer, my skills just aren't there. I'm also not a beginner. I'm somewhere around the intermediate to somewhere below that. I like doing the hard enduro riding, but at a much slower pace where my skills can still keep up. So I need a bike that's still capable enough to do what a 500 EXC can, but at a slower pace. And that's where this bike comes in. I'm looking for longevity, durability, low maintenance, lightweight, and the ability to do everything from commuting, single track, albeit at a slow pace, and multi-day adventure trips where I can put all my gear on here and do multiple day travels without having to change the oil. Figure out who you are as a rider. What do you need out of a motorcycle to complement you? Where are your weaknesses? Try and figure all that stuff out and get the bike that will try and complement you in your weak points. I'm very confident on the road. I come from a road riding background. I used to ride super sports, do track days, knee down, Power Ranger, all that kind of stuff. But when the riding really does start getting at least difficult for me off-road, that's when I really have to pay attention. I really need the bike to kind of get me through those situations, and that's why I love this so much. Overall, I'm very positive of this bike. I really do think this is probably going to be the king of the small displacement dual sports for the foreseeable future, unless Yamaha come to the table, and I sure hope they do. Regardless, I'll be out on the trails enjoying this magical motorcycle, and hopefully this has given you the information to either move in a different direction or take the leap and join the 300L club. Until next time, guys, don't forget to stay shiny side up, and I'll catch you in the next video. See you later.